integrated employment for people with disabilities. The first recommendation in the paper was to bring together the private sector, investors in the disability community to begin identifying ways which investors can leverage the $40 trillion worldwide that is managed under social and environmentally responsible investment frameworks that drive greater inclusion of people with disabilities into all levels of the private sector, from entry-level positions to boards of directors, which is where we want to be. So today, our purpose will be to gain insights from those in the investor community, thank you guys for joining, about the steps investors are taking to work with the companies in which they invest to push disability inclusion higher on the organization's agendas. So the panelists also share ideas, lessons learned from their experience that investors and corporate execs alike are fostering greater disability inclusion across the private sector. Much of what we'll talk about is focused on the concept called ESG. That's the acronym for Environment, Social, and Corporate Governance. What is ESG, you ask, if you haven't looked it up yet or aren't familiar with it? ESG is a framework that's increasingly used by investors of all kinds, right, to ensure companies operate in a way that helps rather than hurts the environment. It fosters positive outcomes for society, including greater disability inclusion, and are managed in a way that's ethical, transparent, and creates long-term value for investors and society. So we as people with disabilities must be at the table to advance equity for people with disabilities, to ensure we're part of the solution, part of the conversation, part of the decision-making, and asking about those considerations of diversity and equal opportunities for employment. So it's a little about me, a little bit about the panel. You know, you've heard from Eddie in his opening comments, but I'd like just to take a few minutes to introduce him anyway, as he has been a leader for many of us. And he's a senior partner at Global Goals Advisory, one of the collaborators in developing this whole panel series, as well as an award-winning, internationally acclaimed humanitarian, thinker, writer, consultant, and speaker. We probably should have had him do more speaking. Diagnosed with SMA, spinal muscular atrophy, at age 2 and given only 5 years to live, he's clearly gone on to become a beacon of hope and possibility for people with disabilities all over the world and has made every single minute count and an incredible impact. Even more impressive, Eddie is campaigning to be the first wheelchair user to travel into outer space as a call to action around relentless inclusion and accessibility for persons with disabilities. I just watched Richard Branson on the Tonight Show, the morning shows, and of course in the air. So another timely hit there. So again, truly thrilled you were able to join us today. So on to our panelists. Let's move through quickly. So Carol Nolan Drake. Carol, thank you for being here. Carol is the founder and CEO of Carlow Consulting, LLC, which is a business that Carol started in January 2017 to provide consulting on corporate governance, establishing ESG programs, and reporting. And prior to that, Carol served 3 successive administrations of Ohio governors, including being appointed to serve on the board of trustees for a large institutional investor, the Ohio Deferred Compensation Board. And in addition, Carol served 5 years on the Council of Institutional Investors Board, including holding the position of treasurer and chair of the Audit and Policies Committees. So welcome, Carol. Thank you. Great connection of policy and advocacy to lead into our conversation today. Lisa, thank you for being here as well. Lisa Woll is the CEO of USSIF, the Forum for Sustainable and Responsible Investment. USSIF is the leading voice advancing sustainable investing across all asset classes. The mission of USSIF is to rapidly shift investment practices towards sustainability, focusing on long-term investment and a generation of positive social environmental impacts. And I understand you also just had this similar conversation at your conference, so thank you for doing that. We're eager to learn some of what you have shared and picked up from your other participants. USSIF's members of $3 trillion, $5 trillion, in assets under management of advisement, including investment management advisory firms, mutual fund companies, banks, credit units, and community development organizations. Really an asset to this conversation for sure. And last but certainly not least, Charles Spearman is here with us. Welcome. Charles is the Global Head of Diversity and Inclusion and the Co-Head of Human Resources Strategic Operations at Guggenheim Partners, LLC, which is a global asset management firm with roughly 315 billion assets under management. In Charles's role at Guggenheim, he leads selected human capital-based strategies, operations, and innovations, and is responsible for the development and implementation of firm-wide diversity and inclusion strategies, vendor diversity, and equal opportunity compliance. Charles also has served as a federally appointed senior advisor to a commissioner at the U.S. Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, and has served in various leadership roles at the Texas Department of Commerce and the U.S. Department of Commerce. And then, of course, Charles's board service on the New York, New Jersey Minority Supplier Development Council, the Women's Business Enterprise Council, and the Alliance of Securities and Financial Educators. I could probably do their intros all day, but I am very eager to hear from everybody. So just a little bit of housekeeping as we welcome you again. Please do a brief description of yourself when you do your introduction, and also let people know when you are stopping speaking, so that we can continue the conversation seamlessly and people can keep track with us today. So I'm going to just start posing a few questions. Hopefully none of them are big surprises, but let's start off, if we can, with the big picture, right? Let's lay the framework here as we continue to unpack, right, and create this connection between disability inclusion and ESG. So Charles, it's okay with you, I'm going to start with you. And if you can actually opine for us and share your thoughts on the bigger picture and explaining how diversity and inclusion in all of its forms and fashions is critical to achieving the vision of ESG.
Yes, first of all, thank you, Merrill, for the introduction, and thank you to the panelists. Particularly, thank you to Go17 Partners, the Global Goals Advisory, as well as the Harkin Institute. It's really a pleasure to be here and honored to be a part of the panel today with Carol, Eddie, Lisa, and also I had a chance to talk with Jessica as well as Robert, who were critical in making sure that this program takes off. So thank you very much for that opportunity.
And this is Merrill interrupting Charles and say thank you for making all of those appropriate nods to our partners and leaders, and I echo those sentiments. Thank you so much. Merrill has finished talking.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'd like to go back to your definition, I think, when you started out with the environmental, social, and governance criteria. And I think, I guess the way that I think about it, and I assume a lot of others, is that you have a set of standards. And by the way, I was supposed to, I think, identify sort of where my setting is. I didn't do that. I'm sitting in front of a sort of a lemon sorbet wall with a white fireplace, and to my left, on my left shoulder, is a trumpet, which I don't play. I learned early on that you know, being a musician was not going to be my future. So my dad asked me very politely to not play the cornet anymore, and so that was a smart move on his part. And I followed advice really well. But I would like to just kind of make sure that in terms of the framework, that at least I think about it from the role that I have at Guggenheim, is that we have environmental, we have social, and we have governance. And when we think about the environment, I don't think we should exclude diversity and inclusion in that conversation. I think often it has been excluded, but when we think about you know, communities that have been impacted by the environment, many of those have been indigenous communities, communities of color that have felt the negative impacts of you know, waste and water runoffs, of those types of things. So I think as part of our conversation, and we won't get to all those issues today, but that we should think about the fact that diversity and inclusion applies to our environmental aspect, certainly from a governance perspective. I think we of course have to think about our internal controls as an organization, and those internal controls aren't only about compliance with respect to the industries that we're in, but also compliance with respect to federal laws, state laws, and local laws that we also should be cognizant of, and also have, you know, policies and practices in place that preclude discrimination and that enhance diversity and inclusion. And of course, where I think most people think of diversity and inclusion, that it falls squarely within the social aspect of ESG, which is our relationship with employees, of course, our suppliers, our customers, and the communities where we operate. So these are critical factors that diversity and inclusion can play a part in all of those. Diversity, equity, and inclusion, as a matter of fact, can play a role in all of those areas. And so if I can just take another minute just to talk about the idea of diversity and inclusion as it relates to these areas, it's the idea of we're very different as a society in many different ways, and today our focus is obviously on disability differences, but the intersection is broad. It's race, ethnicity, gender, or sexual orientation. All of the things that make us human. And Lisa, I think you mentioned, I think in an email, Judy Human, and I think she's a perfect example of all those intersections that we'll cover today. But the idea, of course, I think what we want to do is to make sure that those differences are included, and not only included, but that they have the opportunity to excel. And so I'll stop there because I know that there are so many other points that we want to discuss, but I hope that was enough to establish at least a framework. The good news, I think, is that while we still have a long way to go with respect to diversity and inclusion within the context of ESG, we are seeing that leaders, particularly certain groups, are making really enormous strides. And just what I think it was May, where you had the state comptroller as part of an investor group really talk about the fact that $2.8 trillion of investor signatories, where we really want to see that there's disability inclusion included as part of the assessment of our investment companies. So I'll stop there, Merrill.
I appreciate that, Charles. Charles has finished speaking, and I think we were so excited to jump into this conversation today. We have forgotten all sorts of things. So I will also just add that I am a white appearing person. I identify as female. My pronouns are she and hers, and so we apologize for adding these pieces in incrementally along the way here. Talk about making it personal throughout. So Lisa, I'm going to tee you up a little bit here. So if you can maybe speak to the investors, the members of USSIF, that is a mouthful to say, who are increasingly seeing the connection between disability inclusion and the ability of companies to create long-term value for investors and society as a whole, and explain why the investors are more focused on disability inclusion than ever before, because I think we are all hanging on edge to hear that. I am done speaking now.
Thanks, Merrill. I am Lisa Woll. I'm a middle-aged white woman. My hair is brownish blonde. I'm sitting in a room that I cannot describe as lemon sorbet, but more like a muddy beige. And I just give you props for the lemon sorbet. That was a really great description. I've got like a ceramic pot behind me, a picture. I'm wearing a purple shirt that have fish on it. I think that's what they are. And I'm very pleased to be here today. So Merrill, I might start by saying I'm not sure investors are more interested and knowledgeable about disability than ever before. I think it has become something that has risen to the broad group of social issues and governance issues that investors are considering. But for example, you referred to this investor letter on corporate disability inclusion, right, which came out several years ago. And Charles, I think you referred to that as well. And it had a bunch of big asset managers and several state treasurers. And before we had our own conference, I reached out to numbers of them to see what they had done since signing this letter since 2019. And there had not been a lot of activity, particularly among the asset managers. It was something that they had taken on and we're starting to look at as sort of a broad ESG focus. But just to give you a sense of like, what does an investor do? What are their ways that they can influence the investor process? One is the way you construct a portfolio. What companies are you choosing to be in that portfolio? Are you going to look at the best actors across the DEI spectrum, but particularly focus on disability? Are you going to go to the companies that are signatories to the Disability Equality Index, which came out with a report yesterday and said that there are 272 companies that have become best places to work if you have a disability, except for areas of advancement where they're still lacking about how do you get from one job to the C-suite or somewhere beyond where you get hired. So that's the first way an investor can influence this, is making disability inclusion and advancement and knowledge a key part of whether a company becomes part of your portfolio. I don't think most investors are there yet. The other piece is around shareholder engagement, which has been a primary way. And for those of you who've watched the proxy season, meaning shareholder votes at public companies this year, you have seen a massive increase in proposals on social issues, in large because of what we have all experienced as a country and as a world in the last year and a half, both from COVID, racial justice, racial injustice protests, etc. And so there has not yet been a proposal put forward on disability. And I think we're waiting to see that happen and to see what the SEC would do with that once a company got a proposal on disability inclusion. And then, of course, there is a third way investors can contribute to this, and that is by being very cognizant of making an effort to hire staff with disabilities. I mean, we forget that. You know, our members are from really small firms, 2 or 3 person financial advisor shops, to massive banks and financial institutions with tens of thousands of employees. You know, we've been talking a little bit about how do you walk this walk if you're bringing it to companies to walk the talk. And so I think that's where we are. I think there's a lot of opportunity. One of the treasurers of New York State, he sent a letter to 82 companies. There has been an increase in the companies signed on to the Disability Inclusion Index. And so I do think there has been a starting point, but it is slow days. And I was talking with a good colleague who's done shareholder work for a decade. And he said, you know, when we wanted to make sure that Indigenous rights got focused on, we needed to make sure we had actually a group that was working on only that. And I think that's where we need to get with disability. We need to really get investors to understand what it is in its fullness. And it is a big definition, you know, running across so many different facets of a person. And then we have to explain to them, like, how do you make this happen internally in the work that you do? And I think we have years to go till we get to a kind of threshold, but I think there definitely have been important steps taken in the last 3 years.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa is done speaking. So that was really helpful. And I appreciate the continuing to elevate the concept of companies, you know, and hiring people with disabilities and getting involved engaged in the DEI index and, you know, the valuable 500 and making commitments, that intentionality to hire people with disabilities, right, and move that career track along. So I think we should put that one a little bit in the parking lot. I'd love for you to unpack everybody, you know, to talk a little bit more about that as well. So Carol, building off of that, you spend a lot of time at the intersection of the private sector policymakers and ESG as a business strategy, which is like the key point here. It is part of the business strategy. What role does public policy play in helping investors be more proactive in integrating disability inclusion into ESG investing frameworks? I'm done speaking now.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thank you. So hi, I'm Carol, and I'm thrilled to be here with all of you as well, and especially appreciate Bob Ludke's invitation to be on the panel as well as to participate in the white paper. Let me describe myself. I am a person that has long red hair and freckles based on my Irish heritage. I'm wearing a green blazer today. I'm in my living room, which has become my Zoom office for the last 18 months or so. Behind me on one shoulder over here is a large print of the American bald eagle. And behind me on the other shoulder is the baby grand piano where I learned to play the piano, sort of to tip to Charles' musical instrument behind him. And it's a beloved artifact from my childhood. I'm so happy that it's here. I am a registered federal lobbyist, so I spend a lot of time in the federal policy space. And so I can tell you that there is an intersection between the work of investors and the work of government, and not just the federal government, but state and local governments play such an important role for the disability community, and that advocacy must cascade from the federal government to the local government, whereas, as we all know, local politics makes such a difference. And those politicians need to hear from their voters who may be disabled or have family members that are disabled. So I have 3 quick points I want to touch on. The first is the role of the federal government. They are the largest employer, and so they have the greatest amount of federal dollars that can go toward training for disability purposes, hiring, promotion, retention, and accessibility within the workplace. And I was very pleased when President Biden signed the executive order on June 25th for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility in the federal government. And I will point you to the White House website where you can access the executive order and a fact sheet about the order. And the other great thing about it is that you can not only read it with a contrast, or you can also expand the text. So it's easier for people who have some sight issues to read. So I think that's just another example of making a federal policy available to people who have a disability. It expands training. It requires the Department of Labor and other federal agencies to coordinate together. It's a long order, so I won't spend time on it, except to say that it is one of the first times that the federal government, and particularly our president, has said that accessibility in the workplace is important. And so that's the kind of activity that investors will see coming right from the top. The president of the United States has said this is a priority, and that federal budget dollars will go for that. The second piece that I think is really important for investors, particularly institutional investors, is that many of their own beneficiaries, their benefit recipients, are disabled. Now, they may have been disabled on the job, or they may have come into employment with a disability, and they've had some accessibility and opportunities for the employer to provide that particular kind of access to that job. And what we know is that when people are disabled on the workplace, they may have to take a disability retirement, and they're not able to make a living off that. They are young, they're too young for Social Security, so they need some opportunity for additional work. And these are the investors that are investing in the very companies we're talking about for those returns for beneficiaries. So it is the perfect opportunity. It's really the sweet spot, I think, that Lisa mentioned, for investors to talk to companies about how important it is to have meaningful work. And the third piece is really about COVID and its aftermath. What we know as investors is we want companies to thrive. Investors are usually invested for the long term in companies, so they want some success. And what do they need? They need a vibrant workforce. Working from home could be a perfect opportunity for an individual with a disability to provide that value to an employer, not much, as well as provide something back to that individual's self-worth and family needs. And so that is another conversation that we need to have. I had a great conversation with Jonathan Kaufman earlier in July to get ready for this panel. I mean, he is a superstar for the Harkin Institute. He's written for Forbes recently about this issue. And here's a quote that he said to me. He said, "The disabled community is one that anyone can join at any time through shared experiences across race, sex, orientation, and age." And if that isn't a way for investors to grasp this issue going forward as their pensioners live longer and more active lives, I'm not sure what else we could do. But that point is to have a common language about it, to help investors engage with companies on that social piece that Charles and Lisa mentioned. And so I'll stop there with my remarks, but I'm happy to talk a little bit more about investors at a later time.
Yes, this is Merrill speaking. We will be back to you, Carol. You are not off the hook here at all, and really appreciate those comments. And yes, I was fortunate enough to speak with Jonathan on the prior panel, and we do talk a lot about that, right? The disability community is not monolithic. People with disabilities, right? There's a lot of intersectionality. We have multiple identities, marginalized and otherwise, that are brought to the table and bring value to companies. And your point on this opportunity maybe that COVID did bring. I don't want to give COVID too much credit here, but people with disabilities have long been advocating for telework, as needed, and people can contribute virtually very much to a workplace environment. Before I jump to our next round of questions and begin to dig in a little, I do see Eddie's hand raised on here, clearly working the Zoom feature. So let's pause for a minute and turn this over to Eddie. Please go ahead.
Sure, thanks, Merrill. And for everybody, I am a newly minted 30-year-old Black man who uses a wheelchair, wearing a very flamboyant and fabulous blue-green tracksuit in front of a beige wall, strategically positioned in front of an orange print. There were a few things that I just wanted to echo, which I think are absolutely important. I think several of the speakers mentioned the fact that, advancement within sort of the world of work remains an issue for people with disabilities. And I think so much of this is really around, what Charles calls sort of cultural competency and sort of shifting perceptions about what people with disabilities are capable of doing. I've got a string of meetings lined up today. And this morning when I arrived at a building, somebody asked me, are you here for a doctor's appointment? And it took me a while to sort of figure out that, oh, well, because I use a wheelchair, there's sort of this perception that like, I must be here for medical reasons. I couldn't be here for anything else, right? And so if we're trying to sort of promote opportunities for people with disabilities to enter the C-suite, to operate within boardrooms and really become leaders, then part of that perception work becomes absolutely important. The other thing that I wanted to say, which I think all of the speakers touched upon in one way or another, is that I think the value of disability inclusion is not just in terms of representation. As we speak now, this method of communication through an audio-visual platform, and what we're seeing in tech in terms of audio-driven, social media and others, all of these innovations are really designed around the lived experiences of people with disabilities. And so the value creation there is also core business value creation, right? Not just representation, but really thinking about what does a value chain look like in terms of corporate life and product development. And then finally, I think the intersectionality piece is absolutely key. Merrill, you touched on this. I think the invitation is that intersectionality becomes a methodology. If we really harness people's differences and lived experiences, again, beyond representation, but really in service of innovation, then diversity, equity, and inclusion becomes something that is of strategic value and strategic importance across the value chain of any given sort of corporate entity. So I just thought I'd sort of flag some of those points because I thought they were beautifully articulated by our fellow panelists, and that I think that this will become important for investors to know as we begin to sort of map out disability inclusion for the foreseeable future in the context of ESG. I'm Eddie, and I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Eddie. This is Merrill. Thank you, Eddie. Yes, and I love the fact that you pick those salient points, right? Like help focus us and elevate them. And I think it's really important. As somebody who works for Anthem, which is a healthcare company, it is reminding people everywhere we go, and we're speaking to people, that having a disability does not equate to being sick, right? It does not equate, to not feeling well and continuing to socialize, right? That people with disabilities, can create this equitable space in an inclusive, society as we continue to move that way. So really important to keep these points at the forefront. Thank you. So Lisa, I want to bump back over to you, if I may, for a minute and see if you can speak a little for us. We want to talk now about engaging investors in disability inclusion, right, in the ESG conversation. So been recent developments at the SEC that you have mentioned and teed up in some of our prep conversations, but around how companies must better describe how they recruit, invest in, and retain human talent, as you call it, but people. Sometimes I refer to myself as a humanoid even, but at all levels of the organization, and very focused. We want everybody focused on advancement, as based on people's interests. And how can the work of the SEC be used to help advance disability inclusion across the private sector?
Sure. One thing I did want to mention, I saw it on Twitter this morning, is that the vice president is having a meeting with disability advocates coming up around voting rights. And I just think that is a fantastic thing. And I just wanted to put it out there because that I think is new news as of this morning. So when we talk about accessibility and inclusion, that is obviously an incredibly important issue. So the SEC, for those who have no idea what the SEC is, it's the Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States. This brings me to one of my points that we can perhaps come back later, which is how do you bring the language of the disability rights advocates and community and the language of investment, which loves to be as obfuscating as possible for the most part, in a way that there can be meaningful conversations between the two, and one can understand where investors are coming from and disability rights advocates are coming from. There's a lot of learning to be done on both sides, but I'll leave that aside for the moment. We can come back to that. So I think there's a real opportunity at the Securities and Exchange Commission. There is going to be a rulemaking this year on board diversity. There is going to be a rulemaking on climate change disclosure. And I mention that because in the request for comment on climate change disclosure, there was an ask for information on what other social and environmental governance issues we thought they should take up. We have always supported a broad environmental, social, and governance criteria framework. We don't think it should be done one issue at a time. But the SEC, the new chair, and the former acting chair, Allison Lee, they have been very forthright in their commitment to doing work around ESG disclosure. I had the opportunity to talk with the former acting chair and now just Commissioner Allison Lee at our conference, and I thought it would be worthwhile to mention what she said, which was that advancing DEI is one of the most important things we need to focus on at the SEC and in the economy at large. The SEC created human capital disclosure several years ago, and she talked about looking at potential requirements about human capital disclosure related to diversity of the workforce as part of a human capital disclosure update, and thinking about requiring diversity data and considering whether disability data should be in there. So I think there's a really open door at the SEC for conversations about disability. And the Congress has also taken up consideration of ESG disclosure. The House passed several bills a few weeks ago. I don't expect they'll be taken up in the Senate anytime soon, or we'll see them become law. So there is an opportunity at the SEC, both around broad ESG disclosure and human capital disclosure, to move these issues forward. I also wanted just to bring up the ask of Nasdaq to the Securities and Exchange Commission around board diversity, where they asked Nasdaq listed companies to explain why, or to have at least what they called 2 diverse directors, including one who self-identifies as female and one who self-identifies as either an underrepresented minority or LGBTQ. The disability rights community came out immediately with an ask to add disability to that. And I think, the SEC has said they will make a rule this year on board diversity, and the community, represented here, but the disability rights community should really take this opportunity to be having conversations with the SEC about a broader definition of diversity that would be inclusive of that community. So those are some of the opportunities that I see. I think there are many more opportunities, but I'll leave it at that. And this is Lisa, and I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Lisa. No, I think that's, I think these are all conversations that we should be having, and especially ensuring that there is representation on boards, very much so. And I think that's a great sort of segue into, you know, teeing Charles up here a little bit to talk about how investors are looking across, right, the full portfolio of investments. With that lens and focus to diversity, inclusion, and the commitments and outcomes, and what that means for companies in which they invest. So this is Merrill England speaking.
Great. Hi, this is Charles again, and I did not describe, I'm an African-American male. I am in my 60s, and I am wearing a pink shirt with a gray jacket. Before we talk about that, I did want to acknowledge something that Eddie had mentioned, and Carol and Lisa, I think, alluded to in an email, and that's the idea of cultural competency, which, because I think part of the conversation, while we can talk about sort of the technical issues, the regulatory issues, and the environmental issues, I think it has to start with that personal storytelling that Lisa, I think you referred to this yesterday evening. And Eddie, you described it, you know, so poignantly, and I'm sorry that you experienced that situation this morning. You know, these are the kinds of stories that help illuminate for us, and so the change begins with on an individual level. And part of what we do at Guggenheim is we have storytelling. We bring in speakers to talk about their experiences. Because often that cultural competency gap, it really is critical for systemic change. Without sort of that emotional connection often, or without the sort of relationship connection, the idea that I as a manager, I as a leader need to implement or institutionalize changes can be overlooked, and not with intentionality, but because of the lack of connection. So I did want to make that point. You know, when you're, you know, and if there are any chief diversity officers on this call or watching or tuning in, you know, often we look at, you know, sort of three areas, one or maybe even four. We look at the individual, we look at the team level, we look at systemic practices, and we look at the communities in which we operate. And we try to figure out ways in which we can enhance inclusive practices in one of those four areas. And we look for catalysts, or we look for reasons that might connect with whoever those decision makers are. Going back to the investor piece, Merrill, didn't want to lose sight of the question that you've asked. One of the areas that as a firm, that other firms experience is that the request from in our RFPs, our request for proposals. When I started at Guggenheim, which will be my 10th year, 5 years prior to that, Guggenheim was a client. I would see questions about your company's diversity and inclusion practices that only ask one question from an institutional investor. And this could be a pension fund, a major pension fund, and it would be, do you believe in diversity and inclusion? And that was the extent of the interest that, and what, however that was valued or weighted was often unknown. But in the past 10 years, the type of investor questions have been more granular in nature. They've included questions about, give us actual demographic data, to give us your diversity spin, to tell us what organizations that you've become a part of that advance inclusive practices. These are the kinds of record-keeping metrics, catalysts that I think, as Carol, you've alluded to, and Lisa, that we have to hold investor managers, investment management companies, you know, to hold their attention to focus on these issues, because they're important to the stakeholders. And particularly when we talk about institutional funds that are you know, representations of you know, teachers, firefighters, individuals who may have disabilities or represent different demographic groups. So that's one of the ways I think that is critical for us to think more about. I think we're going to see more changes. Many of you may be familiar with the Dodd-Frank Act. There was a tiny section in the Dodd-Frank Act that a lot of people overlooked. I think it was Section 208 that dealt with the Office of Minority and Women Inclusion. And the disclosure by firms is voluntary. So the question becomes, do I have to provide information about what my firm looks like, what it does on a day-to-day basis around diversity and inclusion? And whether we're talking about Nasdaq, the SEC, or we're talking about OMWI disclosures, those are the kinds of metrics, those are the kinds of things that I think will change the needle. I was fortunate to be at the commission, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in 1990, shortly after the passage of the ADA. And, while there were substantial changes that were made, we still have a long way to go as far as cultural competency. We still have HR professionals who are unfamiliar with the responsibilities of what is an accommodation responsibility. So there's a huge spectrum, and one of the things that I think is important for us to take away from this conversation is that, Eddie, you talked about the importance of intersectionality. I think also the importance of allies is really critical, because we have so many different organizations, not just in the different demographic groups, but even within those demographic groups, there are probably 30 or more major disability advocacy groups. And you can take any other demographic and say that there are twice as many or as many. Part of the challenge, I think, for employers is how do we try to coalesce? And so one of the things that we did, I'll just give a quick story on this, is that when we launched our supplier diversity program, which is relatively unusual for a firm of our size. We have 2,500 employees worldwide, and most firms that have a supplier diversity program are much larger and obviously have greater spend. But we brought together the different certification groups as a culture competency. So we didn't have this group, over here and this group over here. The idea was, where can we make a difference together? That's a difficult road to toe, I recognize. But if you look back at the civil rights movement, that coalition effort was really what created the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so I think we have to think about that. And what does that mean for 2021, particularly when you think about social justice initiative? And we saw white kids who were in the street marching with African Americans and others. And so I think that's important for us to think about as a takeaway, is how does the disability community work with those other communities, and how vice versa do the other communities, because there is that intersectionality that Eddie spoke so eloquently about. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Charles. This is Merrill speaking. It's a journey, right? It is a journey, and we do spend also a lot of time on allyship, and it is one of my platforms, and I'm so glad you brought up the value of allies. It also leads to the conversation too, if we have time, to speak a little bit about, associate resource groups, business resource groups, and creating allyship, within companies that drives to foster, inclusion and diversity and support. So hopefully we'll be able to, I don't know, we have 13 minutes left as our time check to see what we can cover here. But springboarding off of, Charles's point there, Carol, based on your experience, right, serving on the board of trustees for a large public investor, what are those recommendations? What are some tangible thoughts that we can really leave people with and share that, on how they can use, right? People want to use ESG investing as a way to advance disability inclusion within the private sector. If you could give us some details. This is Merrill, I'm done speaking.
Hey, hi, this is Carol. Again, I'm beginning to speak. I think that's a great question. When I served on the Public Employees Retirement System board, it was drilled in our head that we needed to act as fiduciaries for our beneficiaries. And we had almost 1 million members across the spectrum of age and orientation and so forth. So we knew we had an obligation to do what was right with the billions of dollars of assets we had under management. What made the difference for the whole disability, or could make the difference for the whole disability environment, is to look for that hard data. so that if we can gather the white papers, like the Harkin Institute white paper and other reports and studies that show that value add for investors to then engage with companies, that would be one takeaway. And I look to all of the progress, well, actually years it took, for diversity and inclusion, starting with global investors and other countries who were well ahead of the United States in putting women and minorities on public company boards. What did it take for institutional investors? It took the data to show that that mix of board members around the table added basis points, literally, and could advance returns for those companies. We're not quite there yet from the perspective of telling that story, as Lisa has mentioned and Charles mentioned. But if we can gather the champions together, we know there are companies that do a great job advancing hiring and promotion for the disabled community. We know that there are other investors, as I mentioned, who have a large population, police and fire pension funds, other pension funds where they have workers who are disabled. If we can gather those particular organizations together and then look to the national groups, the Business Roundtable, the Chamber of Commerce, that represent these employers looking for workers. And at the time, with all of the shareholder proposals that Lisa mentioned around ESG in this proxy season, we know that coalitions can make a difference, and look to no further than the Exxon situation where you had one small investor with a large coalition that provided investors with the opportunity to say to that company, we need 3 new directors to put a better direction on that company. So I would look for coalitions. I would help look for the script or value added with what's going on, as Lisa mentioned, at the SEC, the Department of Labor, with ERISA resources for ESG. And if you can put that together, I do think we can lift this platform in a much more successful way than taking a piecemeal approach. And I'm finished with my remarks.
Merrill,
Thank
can I
you,
jump
Carol.
in
This is Merrill
real quick?
speaking. Yes, Lisa, please go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to add on to Carol's great remarks about the Department of Labor and ERISA law. So what ERISA does is it governs pension plans. And there has been an effort under the last administration to preclude their ability to consider ESG criteria and also to vote proxies, which is how you impact companies' behavior, that in shareholder campaigns. That is changing under this administration. It's incredibly important because most Americans have no discretionary income to invest to the degree that they're invested at all. They're invested in a retirement plan. If we don't get more retirement plans to have ESG options, we're not going to see continued acceleration of investment in ESG related funds. What is really interesting for anyone who may be a federal employee is that the Federal Thrift Savings Plan is the largest retirement plan in the country. It has not until now, well, still doesn't have any ESG options in their plans, even though you have all of these people who go work for the federal government to change labor laws, to change climate laws, to work on racial justice issues, so many different issues, international development. In the summer of 2022, so next summer, they will be adding a mutual fund window, which will have ESG options. And so you're starting to look at changing the retirement system, having larger ability to put in ESG funds, hopefully that are also paying attention to disability. We start to see a capital flow that's very different than what we're seeing today. And I just wanted to throw that in there because it's such an important point about retirement. So I appreciate that you brought that up, Carol. And I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Lisa. This is Merrill speaking. Yes, please jump in. This is a discussion. I love it. And I think, building off of each other's points creates so much value here for the participants. So we have 7 minutes left. I have one general question that I want to ask you guys that we're starting to get in, and then just we want to take some Q&A from the participants. But I did take a scan on the participant list and saw many of our friends from the disability community who have tuned in. So if all of you can take a shot here at answering and addressing, how can the disability community, how can people with disabilities become more closely allied with investors and better communicate to and with investors the value proposition of disability inclusion? so that we really get people with disabilities, engaged in this evolution and this journey. This is Merrill, I'm done speaking. Oh, don't make me call on you. So I don't know. Okay, let me see. Carol, can I ask you to weigh in here? Perfect. Thank you.
Let me just kick it off because I think that's such a great question. And I kind of alluded to some of it. It really is about finding those champions within various communities who are willing to speak out, have the common language that Jonathan mentioned, so they can help these individuals understand the value for this kind of activity and work. I think that someone like Eddie, I mean, we can't put everything on Eddie's shoulders. Poor Eddie, he would be like, no, I've got enough I have to go to get to space. But this is so important. There are politicians that can be champions. There are heads of corporations that need to be involved in this. And so I know we'll have a long list coming from this panel. The organizations that Charles knows about and Lisa, with all of them. What do you follow? You follow the money, right? This is where the capital is going as we look for the future of work and what changed after COVID. So all of those frameworks are going to be helpful. And that's just to tee up your great question. And then I'll let the other participants speak.
Merrill, if I could just piggyback off of what Carol was just speaking about, I think it's really important also that the investment community and private sector leaders realize that people with disabilities are also experts, that we ourselves are practitioners, we are leaders. I happen to serve as an advisory board member for a major Fortune 500 company. I sit on a number of boards. I advise at a strategic level, and so do many people with disabilities. We roll impacts, right? And there's a window of opportunity that's opening up right now where disability justice practitioners are really leaning in on the strategic side and really advising leaders on very substantive, sort of meaningful work that will hopefully move the needle disability inclusion, right? And so that means that, people with disabilities need to be paid equitably. People with disabilities need to be brought into the room and seen as leaders and seen as experts and seen as people who are really helping to catalyze value across society. And so, I just want to see more of us in the room so that we can begin to really disrupt and shake things up. I'm Eddie, and I'm done speaking.
Thank you, Eddie. This is Merrill. Yes, shake it up and get involved. I always say the best way, people say, how can, we have more decision-making authority and, time at the table around healthcare decision-making. And it is about, what I say, like infiltrating companies, right? Getting people with disabilities to be inside companies and helping to transform them, both on very practical and innovative approaches. So Charles or Lisa, I want to make sure that I offer an opportunity for you to respond, and then we're going to take a quick question from the audience before we wrap.
Yeah, I would just say very quickly that I think it's really important that investors and the public at large educate themselves on this issue. I don't think we should be relying on folks with disabilities to educate us. I think we have to really figure out and understand the field. I also do think talking with one another is incredibly important. As I mentioned, the investor language is very obfuscating, can be very intimidating to many people, disabled or not. And we have put some courses, for example, a free 30-minute course for retail investors, so to deconstruct the field of sustainable investing a bit. And that's free, anyone can access this. And I think the disability community also needs to figure out a way to talk to folks who are not familiar with that field, to understand really the broad implications and the needs of that community. And there needs to be more cross conversation. But I think investors and any other professionals, companies, they have an obligation to educate themselves. And even if that starts with showing CripCamp as a way to open up a conversation about, what has happened in the last 50 years, which is astonishing and yet not nearly enough, right? and to understand the trajectory and where else we may need to go, that seems like a great opening to just start to generally bring people into this conversation.
Thank you, Lisa. That was Lisa speaking. Charles, I know you're just about to come on air, and I have one question that was submitted for you. So you may be able to do some dual work in 35 seconds or less, right?
Right.
So this is Merrill speaking, but the question here is, do you believe that the definition of employment should include entrepreneurship? And how can we bring investment support to nascent entrepreneurship and use it as a framework to address systemic unemployment and poverty? So the synergies work and run the only business accelerator for people with disabilities. But since you were going next, I thought I would put that in there. This is Merrill, I'm done speaking. We are running out of time.
Hi, this is Charles. A great question. I was an entrepreneur before I became an employee with Guggenheim Partners. So it's a great question. Whether it's the definition or not, I don't think that is as important as what impact you can have in either forum. And I think to think that whether someone calls you an entrepreneur or an employee makes a difference, I think is probably not going to move the needle as much as what you can do with your power of your pen or the Google. When you asked that earlier question, I think it was important for, if you think about what you could do, just one thing. So Gensler, who's the chair of the SEC, spoke on July 7th, I think it was, to the Asset Management Advisory Committee. And they talked about, what does board diversity look like? And it was gender and race. And so you can write a letter. It says, if you'd like to know more about the advisory committee, please write. You can ask, should we include disability as part of that definition? And I think the answer would be yes. So I think the power of the pen, I'm old enough where, the pen was the term they used, but the power of the typewriter or the computer is where you can start. But I think also, just quickly, is that you have to start with your own cultural competency and learning about the organizations that exist that Eddie and others have alluded to in this conversation. And so to get educated about what's out there, and then use that information to articulate your position to decision makers.
Charles, thank you. This is Merrill. I'm going to wrap us for a minute over. I want to be respectful of everybody's time, but Charles, Eddie, Carol, Lisa, Goal 17 Partners, Harkin Institute, Global Goals, all of you, Verizon, Guggenheim for your sponsorship. We look forward to keep the comments coming, keep the discussion going. Thank you for your advocacy and your work. We learned a lot today. And I hope everybody has a great and healthy rest of the week. We appreciate you and look forward to seeing you next time. This is Merrill. I'm done speaking. The webinar is closed.
Thank you.
Thank you.